Thank you, Dave. What a delightful group of individuals you are. To a psychologist. I've had the opportunity over the last couple of days to listen in on a number of your conversations and to watch you interacting with each other, and I think it's fair to say already that there are 28 individuals in this room at this moment showing psychological symptoms I wish to discuss this evening. And I thought you might like to know who you are. But instead of pointing at you, which would be gratuitous and intrusive, I thought what I'd do is give you a few questions, not Myers-Briggs, that will help you perhaps catch glimpses of yourself as we proceed through my presentation today. Now, I know you've got cell phones and you can use these to answer the questions. I've made some pads of paper available over on the periphery there if you want some. But I'm going to ask you 10 questions requiring single-digit, at most two-digit answers. And so if you want to use the back of the neck of the person in front of you, you can do that as well. So let me start and tell you a bit about the framework for the questions. I'm going to ask you to rate yourself on a set of personality characteristics from 0 to 10. And I'll give you each of these 10 items, and I'll tell you which is the arbitrarily chosen higher score and which is the lower score. So to illustrate, the first one asks you, excuse me, to rate yourself from 0 to 10 on whether you see yourself as outgoing person or more on the reserved side. So if you see yourself as outgoing, 9 or a 10, if reserved, a 0 or 1, and if in between, by all means, use numbers like 5 or 6. And if you're already neurosing over the fact that I didn't actually mention the number 7, and you think it might apply to you, go for it. So you should now have, for question number 1, at least a 1 and at most a 2-digit answer. Question number 2. Are you an easily bored person? High scores or not easily bored? Low scores. So if you're bored already with my presentation, could you guide yourself appropriately in answering that question? Number 3. Are you an optimistic person? High scores or rather more on the pessimistic side? Low scores. Number 4. Are you a thick-skinned individual? High scores or a thin-skinned person? Low scores. This is not a dermatological question. Thick-skinned would mean that you can easily suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous colleagues. Hit me again, Gary, no problem. Low scores would mean you're very sensitive to conflict and insult. Number 5. Are you a blunt and straightforward communicator? High scores, or are you rather more diplomatically sensitive in the way you communicate, perhaps overly sensitive? Low scores. Please don't do what happened at a conference a while ago where a person at the back, realizing that his friend was perhaps more blunt and straightforward than necessary, pointed at him and said, "You are 10." Like that. And the guy responded by putting up his 10 fingers, retracting 9 and rotating 1, therefore showing that you may be blunt and straightforward without saying a word, which he was. Number 6, do you have a high need for excitement? High scores or a low need for excitement? Low scores, and you may define excitement in whatever way is psychologically meaning for you at present, given your age. Number 7, are you a fast-paced person? High scores or a slow-paced person? Low scores. If you're still thinking about that, and predictably some of you are saying, let's see, give yourself a low score perhaps. Yeah. Number 8. This is a tricky one, so I'm going to take it a little more slowly, particularly on the lower scoring end of this dimension. Do you have a high need for social contact? High scores. Or a low need for social contact? Low scores. Low scores on this don't necessarily mean that you're antagonistic or hostile toward other individuals. It simply means, and this is vital, that relative to other people, you often prefer to be on your own. So high scores, high need for social engagement. A low score, no such need, but not necessarily implying antagonism. Number 9, are you a spontaneous person? High scores, or rather more planful, circumspect, low scores? Please don't copy the answers of the person next to you. It's sort of pathetic to cheat on a personality test. What will your score mean when we add it up in a few minutes? Finally, number 10, would you rate yourself into the dimension that has been implicit in the preceding items, and will now make it explicit? And here I want you to use our everyday conception of these terms, rather than any technical knowledge you may have gained from psychology courses or so on. Do you regard yourself as a rather extroverted person, high scores, or rather more on the introverted side, low scores? And now, without calculators or administrative assistance, could you simply add up your total score? Hiding it from the eyes of anyone near you for reasons that will become apparent, particularly when I talk about sexual behavior. And if you could put that away for a few minutes, because I'm now going to tell you a little bit about the field of personality science. Personality psychology is my field, and personality science is a larger field within which it is subsumed. It spans the full spectrum from neurons to narratives, broad canvas. And one of the most dominant perspectives within that field, with which I wish to start today but not finish because there are limitations to it, is what we call trait psychology. And trait psychology presumes that there are 5 major dimensions of personality. These have been retrieved in cultures and linguistic groups around the world. They seem to be universal dimensions of variation. Each of these is normally distributed, and I'm just going to give you a brief hint about what they comprise, and then I'm going to zoom in on one of the dimensions to give us some focus. They spell these 5 dimensions, the big 5 of personality traits, the acronym OCEAN. So O stands, I should tell you one thing before I proceed. Did you know that it is actually anatomically impossible for adults to lick the outside of their own elbows? And did you know that how you responded to that piece of information gives us a hint about how you're going to stand on these different dimensions of personality? Some of you have already tried. Some of you have been surreptitious. Some of you have resolutely refused. So let's take a look. The first O of ocean is openness to experience. This contrasts individuals who have a low threshold for excitement about exploration. They're curious. In contrast to the more closed individual who likes to keep the conventional ways of doing things and doesn't want to budge much. The high open to experience person probably would like to explore, does this actually hold water, or is it just a joke? The closed to experience person, less likely to do so. Now, open to experience people, in terms of that dimension of personality and work, experience success in the creative side of things. So if you love the creative aspect of design, and you've always done things differently, and though you've learned the technical details because you have to, but you most enjoy it when you break set, when you're able to do things differently, you're more likely to score high on a dimension of openness to experience. The C is conscientiousness. In contrast to a more lackadaisical, informal, off-the-cuff kind of style of behaving. Conscientious individuals also do very well in the occupational sphere, in their professional lives. They're promoted more in organizations. But it's not just in the expectable domain of professional behavior. that they succeed, they also succeed in other domains that are rather intriguing. For example, health. Conscientiousness is an extremely good predictor of mortality and morbidity rates. Those who are high in conscientiousness, as measured by the Big Five inventories, I'll tell you how to access those after I finish this, live longer. Now, partially this could be explained by the fact that they're conscientious. That is, they get things done, they are able to follow a physician's regimen and stick to it, whereas those who are less conscientious are more likely to get involved with things that do not conduce to their physical health. Now, would the conscientious people have tried to lick their elbow? I bet not, because they're conscientious, so they're listening to the presentation. But they've probably written a little note to themselves, when get home, check elbow anecdote. Yeah. The E of ocean is extroversion. And I'll have much more to say about that in a few minutes. For now, let's just say that extroverts are strongly motivated to seek out positive stimulation. It's subserved by a neurophysiological system, the dopaminergic system, for those who've been familiar with biology. I suspect that extroverts would have tried to lick their elbow, and if unsuccessful, they have probably successfully licked the elbow of the person sitting next to them. The A is agreeableness. Agreeable individuals are a delight to work with. They're very good in groups. They facilitate things. Their risk is that they may be too agreeable at times. And that may not conduce to their success in organizational life because they can be, at worst, seen as pushovers. So agreeableness, also subserved by a neurophysiological system that is a bit more complex than that of extroversion, are a delight to have. They're valuable for our groups. They lubricate the groups. They keep things going. But for each of these, there's a slight downside. And so the opposite of agreeableness, disagreeableness, has a definite downside. And that is that the risk for such things as cardiovascular failure is much higher for those who are disagreeable. In fact, we often talk about the type A personality as the individual who's time pressured and ambitious, and that is what causes their risky type A cardiac proneness. But it's not that. It is the behavioral pathogen within type A personality is disagreeableness and the hostility that it engenders. And so, might we say that there's anything positive about disagreeableness? Sure there is. We need disagreeable people to fight against egregious acts, to stand up for us when things are going wrong, to say, no, that design is not right. It truly sucks. When other people who are nice and agreeable say, it's just wonderful, awesome, really awesome. So already I hope you're getting a picture that these dimensions of personality aren't the good people and the bad people. They are dimensions of variation across all cultures that have a biological base in part, but as we shall see, are also conditioned and shaped by the culture within which we live. Neurotic individuals, the term is a bit problematic. One of the virtues of it is it completes the word ocean. But I don't think that's sufficient to justify a psychiatric diagnosis. I prefer the term hypersensitive. Individuals who are neurotic are hypersensitive. They're like canaries in mines. They see things coming that others may not see in our organizations, in our projects, in our marriages. And I think that to see them as hypersensitive is a fair way, so that we're not adjudicating them on whether they're good or bad, but in terms of what the dynamics of their behavior may portend. Now, would you go back to that score that you created for yourself? Because I want to tell you a little bit about what it means. The score should range between 0 and 100. So if you scored more than 100, could you add it up again? If you scored less than 0, let's take a workshop on resistance. It is a measure of extroversion. I didn't measure you on the Big Five. However, I told you I would let you know how to discover your score on the Big Five. Just Google Big Five inventories, and there are a whole bunch of them available. The one that I like is from the Cambridge University site. So if you just put Cambridge Big Five personality, I think you'll get to the site where you can score yourself on the Big Five. But there are others as well. There is a kind of gold standard, which is called the Neo-PIR. You can find out about that as well on the web. But that costs money, and it is a much more time-sensitive and demanding set of questions. If you scored 60 or more on the scale I read out to you, for today, think of yourself as being on the extroverted side. If you scored 54 or less for today, just pro tem, provisionally, think of yourself as being on the introverted side. And if you scored 55 to 59, you are a special case. We think of you as being an ambivert, which means you are in between and that you can go in either direction depending on the situational contingencies. There are also some virtues associated with ambiversion, but I will not be able to get into them today because I'm going to contrast the extreme groups, but occasionally I'll just mention some of the virtues of ambiversion. As these are normally distributed, you have a good group of people right in the center, the most frequent group, because it is normally distributed. It's not bimodally distributed, which is why I'm not a big fan of things like the Myers-Briggs that says you're an extrovert or you're an introvert. It's on a scale. It's normally distributed. Now, remember I said don't show people your score? Some of you have already glanced at the person next to you, and you're building up a wad of resentment that you scored in the same general category. So let me give you a greater differentiation of scores. This will also satisfy those of you with a neurotic need for specificity. If you scored 60 to 64, think of yourself as a borderline extrovert. 65 to 69, a moderate extrovert. 70 to 74, a strong extrovert. And 75 or more, an extreme extrovert, in fact, perhaps obnoxiously so. Just perhaps. And if you scored 50 to 54, think of yourself as a borderline introvert. 45 to 49, a moderate introvert. 40 to 44, a strong introvert. And 39 or less, an extreme introvert. In fact, you probably didn't come today. In any sense at all. Now, yeah, they are just as you described, Dave. Yeah. So I wanted to introduce you to some of the biology underlying the study of extroversion. This will be very, very simple, but I think it's important to establish because we are animals, of course. We have biogenic, as I call them, forces that guide us and motivate us, and I think it's important to know what they are. One model, and it's now competed with by other models which do a slightly different job and a better job in some domains, but I like this model because it helps explain a few things that others do not. Posits that the neocortex and arousal level in the neocortex is vital to understanding the nature of introversion and extroversion. The neocortex, of course, we developed as the mammalian brain. It sits on top of the more paleo brain, the reptilian brain, that still acts its influence upon us as humans. But the neocortex allows us to think before acting, to prognosticate before engaging in mere behavior. But for the neocortex to function properly, to guide our problem solving, to guide our project pursuit, it needs to be activated or aroused to an optimal level. And so we can think of an optimal level in this way. Too high a level of neocortical arousal is dysfunctional. You're revving too high, you're buzzing too much. Now, notice that this isn't necessarily unpleasant. You may say, well, I seek that out when I go to a party, for example. I like to get that buzz, and yeah, I'm not solving problems very effectively, but that's not the reason I'm there. But in terms of solving problems and the kind of stuff you do creatively in your work life, an optimal level of arousal is necessary. So too high is suboptimal. And too low, where you're sort of drifting. The lower levels is what in our lab we technically refer to as coma. And individuals vary in their resting levels of arousal in the neocortex. Now, if I were to ask you, who, in the terms of the dimension of extroversion, introversion, is more likely to be at risk for snoring at this moment, indeed might be snoring at this moment, who are they likely to be? My students often don't get this correct. The answer is extroverts. Because extroverts are chronically under the optimal level of arousal in the neocortex. So they seek out stimulation, if you will. They extrovert themselves, not just because it's fun, which it is for them, but it's also conducive to solving their problems effectively, whereas their introverted colleagues working on the same project are over that optimal level of arousal, and consequently for them to contribute in an effective way, they need to gate that stimulation, to dampen it down. And so you'll see, and this is why I referred to this and when I was giving the questions, saying we want to be sensitive about one of these items, that if you are in a group problem-solving situation, you happen to be introverted, and you're overstimulated, you've probably found over the years that you do better if you just walk away, go back to your cubicle or to your office on your own, work, and then come back and join the group. And people may misconstrue you as being antisocial, when in fact, you're just being an introvert, overstimulated because of your chronic arousal level in the neocortex. There are some other ways in which you can look at this. I want you to consider a car containing one extrovert and one introvert driving from the international airport to the conference center. Typically, it's the extrovert who's driving, even if it's the introvert's car. And the reason is to get here from the international airport takes an extrovert about 7 minutes. For an introvert, it takes 42 minutes and a stopover in some strange place midway between. And you can spot extroverts driving on the highway. They need stimulation. So they bounce around a lot. They look at other extroverts driving other introverts away from the conference center. Extroverts do not have smartphones. They have 3 smartphones. And so they're answering a text message they just sent themselves, and they're moving around, and that's fine. That actually enables them to drive better. But the introvert, looking grimly ahead, hoping eventually to get the conference center in one piece, just keeps still, hopes to get there. Now, that's not necessarily a zero-sum game. You can both do that with relative impunity. What is a zero-sum game is the way you negotiate the radio level in the car. Now, this isn't an all-or-none phenomenon. This, again, is what we would call, and you too might, a probabilistic drift. There's a tendency for extroverts, when they get into the car, to turn the radio up to about 110 decibels. This is near the pain threshold. So you have 110 decibels of Yo-Yo Ma or Miley Cyrus booming through the sound system. That's great for extroverts. It gets them up to where they're better able to drive. Introverts have their preferred level of arousal on the radio. Again, what we technically refer to as off. Now, if there were a kind of acoustic justice, you would hope that some compromise might be expected between off and 110 decibels. And it wouldn't be 55 because it's on a logarithmic scale. But anyway, if you guess that, you're with me. That's good. There would be some zone of acoustic justice. But alas, for those of us who are introverts, and I use the inclusive term advisedly, those of us who are introverts, because we're not always what we seem to be, those of you who are extroverts tend to get your way in these little interpersonal altercations. Is that too loud for you? How's this? And they will, in the short term, win these little battles. In the long term, things might be different. We'll see. I can change, you can change your arousal level by the ingestion of certain substances, some of which we'll have in about 42 minutes, some of which we've had throughout the day. So let's start with what I call the brewed awakenings. The first brew would be alcohol. What's the impact of alcohol on the performance of extroverts and introverts? Imagine it's Friday, or having a group get together, have a couple of beers. The extrovert, instead of dancing on the table in convivial delight after a couple of beers, is actually more at risk for being under the table. Because you can see that they already are starting as under the optimal level. Because alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, it lowers, they're teetering down there near the end. They may have to engage in random aggressive or sexual activity in order to get themselves back up again. Otherwise, they're going to be under the table. Introverts, on the other hand, on their way down to coma, which they will reach with sufficient ingestion, notice, pass through a zone in the middle where they're almost pleasant. Of course, they're also convulsed with guilt when they realize how extroverted they had been the day before. How about caffeine? That's different, and I think you'll find it intriguing. I do. The caffeine has a tendency to, it's a stimulant drug, it's a CNS stimulant, so it should have a better effect on extroverts than introverts, because extroverts need that stimulation, and indeed this is the case. Introverts, on the other hand, can have trouble with caffeine, or any other CNS, central nervous system stimulant. There have been studies done on the impact of caffeine ingestion compared to a placebo on individuals who are introverted in tasks in terms of their cognitive performance. And those introverts with caffeine in their system do worse. But what I think you'll find fascinating is that there's a particular zone of exacerbated performance where it's really bad for introverts, and that is quantitative reasoning under time pressure. So I've had the delights of sitting in on a number of your sessions today, and some of the presentations relied a fair bit on your ability to process quantitative information, and to a lesser extent, but still to an extent, spatial information. Introverts who've spiked up on a couple of cups of coffee to be sociable before a technical meeting are likely to find things hard to process, particularly if it's speeded. So if Doug is saying to you, Dave, come on, you do this all the time. What's your prediction of what's going to happen stochastically when this is mounted in this fashion? And you give the impression of not being good on your feet quantitatively. If we slowed it down, and if caffeine was out of your system, what you find is that introverts' quantitative reasoning scores are a little bit higher, actually, than those of extroverts. So what you have is a conspiracy of little things that can make your performance less than you were capable of. And by knowing your personality, it helps us understand that. Who did better in our academic subjects at schools? And I know one of the delights I have in chatting to you is that you come to the conference not just to understand things about your professional lives, but also about your family life. And that's why Dave joking said, who wants to hear from a psychologist at a technical conference? Because you're people. You got kids. You care about your kids. You got parents. You got projects about your parents. You got projects about your kids. And I want to address those issues in this keynote as well. Perhaps more even than personalities at work. It's personalities in the rest of your life and how to live lives that are not torturously stressful for yourselves. So let's talk about your kids, or perhaps let's think about yourself when you were a kid. Who did better in our academic subjects at school? With one great exception, grade exception, not great exception. Introverts do better. There's a 2.5-fold greater likelihood that introverts will get first-class degrees at universities. It holds in the US, it holds in Australia. Why? Why is it that introverts do better? Is it because they have higher IQ? Is it that just extroverts are not quite as bright? No. There's no significant difference in IQ. So what's going on there? I think what's going on is that when extroverts learn, and this may be in their classroom as a grade 5 student, or it may be as they're learning new coding tricks at a conference like this, cranking code and pushing pixels can always be improved. And that's what you do, and you're learning, learning, learning. But the extroverts to learn need to be engaged. They want engagement. So an interesting lecture will do for a few minutes. But at the very beginning, I want to ask you questions because the extroverts need to, okay, I'll do something and then refer back to it. The introverts don't need that as much. Introverts need structure, clarity, good order. And so what happens is that most of the training in school is catering to introverts. And the extroverted kids are going to have a really rough time. And something that makes me very sad is at the back of a 15-year-old or 16-year-old kid's class, it's the extroverts in the back who are slipping into coma. And the parents, when they come home, they say, how was school today? And they know, they don't even need to say that anymore because they know the answer is going to be boring. And so now the parents say, so how boring was school today? Pretty boring. Well, that's relatively exciting. And if they just saw themselves as bored, fair enough. But it's when it transmogrifies into the term stupid that it breaks my heart. Because you have a group of kids, typically, but not restrictively boys, that are showing ways out of the system. When with more stimulation, more engagement, they could survive and flourish. I'm just going to have a very quick word about memory. Oh, remember I said there was one great exception? Do you know what grade it is where extroverts come home with a better report card? Kindergarten. 4-year-old. And why? Because, do you call it kindergarten in Australia? Yeah, okay. In kindergarten, kids are marked on engagement. So if Elizabeth is an extrovert, she gets into extroverted activities, and at the end of kindergarten they say Elizabeth will do well. But that's not true, because then something cruel and unusual happens, and it's called grade 1. And in grade 1, Elizabeth and her brother Michael have to learn to sit still, Michael. Have you seen Michael, the extroverted kid? Well, is he your son? Was he you? Trying to sit still, grade 1. He starts random motor movements to stimulate himself. It goes up to the torso. It culminates in facial grimaces. That's just the teacher. The students also find it really difficult. Meanwhile, their introverted friends already in grade 1 are singing an implicit song that says, I can sit still. I'm going to be an accountant. Drive a BMW. And all of a sudden, you start to see a trend with the introverts doing better and better, the extroverts falling out. Now, who has a better memory? Depends whether we're talking short-term or long-term. Introverts have better long-term memories. The extroverts, better short-term memories. And so you meet somebody at a partner, there's an introvert and an extrovert in your group, and the introvert doesn't get the name. The extrovert says, Polly, Polly, how are you, Polly? Papa Polly. And so they encode it very rapidly and they remember it for the rest of the party. But a week later, the introvert who didn't remember Polly recognizes Polly, and then the name comes back up, whereas the other one said, I've never seen her before. So again, we need both these attributes, don't we? We need short-term memory, we need long-term memory. We need people who are engaged to learn. We need people who are responsive to structure and create structure in their jobs. There's merits on both sides of these dispositions. And in the middle, which I'll have a word to say about in my concluding prayers. Quality-quantity trade-off. One of the groups we're contrasting does things quickly, makes a few mistakes. The other does things carefully, gets it right. That one's pretty obvious, isn't it? The extrovert is the one who says, look, I do things quickly, I make a few mistakes, give me a break. I'm still the fastest neurosurgeon in this city. And there's some truth to that they drive each other to distraction. And in a way, they must continue to do so. Could you imagine our organizations, your organization, run solely by extroverts? Welcome to our company. We don't know what we're doing, but we're pumped. Could you imagine it run solely by introverts? Welcome to our company. We're assiduously working on the Y2K problem and expect to have it done perfectly by Y3K. Is this fair? Of course not. Is there a message in it? You bet. And the message is that these are how those extreme on the scale are seen by their opposites. So the extroverts really want to say, can't you do things faster? And the introvert says, can't you just get it right? And clearly we need both. And clearly in teams, they may contribute both of those attributes effectively. If I left it here, I would have really done you a disservice because I've given you what I call the biogenic roots of our personality, at least one of the big 5 dimensions, and just skimming the very superficial details of it. Excuse me, but we're also socially constructed creatures. We grow up in cultures, and those cultures can differ in which ends of those continua are regarded as socially appropriate, normative, or guiding. So some cultures, as Susan Cain in her book called Quiet, which I recommend to all of you, really a bestseller book for 5 years now, Susan Cain has talked about the extrovert norm, particularly, in North America, but it holds as well in Canada, where I'm from, and also Australia. That the norm is that extroversion is good and introversion not quite so good, so parents are worried if a kid is too introverted in class. But what Susan Cain has drawn attention to is how some cultures is the very opposite. In some Asian cultures, not all of them, it gets complicated and we have to differentiate, but in some, the introvert norm is paramount. And parents call psychologists because they're worried that their children are too extroverted. And so culture helps craft the way we implement our biogenic traits. So it's a combination of these. It's in a way nurturing our natures. The old contrast between nature and nurture is long past. We know now that they're highly interdependent, and even the genome can be influenced by social forces, like whether you're lonely, chronically lonely, or not. So it's more complex than simply nature-nurture. But I just want to give you a couple of illustrations of what it's like to live in a culture that emphasizes extroversion as the norm. There was a study done in England a number of years ago that I had a kind of oblique relationship to that looked at the interactions of individuals from cultures that were both introverted and extroverted. And the difference in their interaction style, there we go. The interaction style is really quite different. Extroverts like to stand close for comfortable communication. A lot of body contact, usually unsolicited. A lot of eye contact or mutual gaze. We found in some of our research that extroverts use more diminutive names when they meet somebody. So it may be that you meet Charles, and then it rapidly becomes Charlie, and then Chuck, and then Chuckles baby. Whereas for introverts, it remains Charles until you've given him permission to move to a more intimate level. What happens when an introvert, to be polite, meets an extrovert trying to be polite? It gives rise to a phenomenon called the United Nations dance. And this dance starts with an extrovert. Oh, incidentally, you won't see this. You won't see it when we break after my presentation and have drinks. Unless it's videotaped and you speed the videotape up, then you see this dance. And don't comment in the reception about the interaction style of the people with whom you're interacting. Could you promise me that? Don't say, hey, that's just what Professor Little was saying you would do. How are we doing? Now, the extrovert wants to get close, the introvert wants to go back. It gives rise to a vector resolution problem. There are a limited number of ways it can be resolved. One is for the person from the introverted culture, which happened to be England, to go bolt backwards, which doesn't look very genial at a cocktail party. The resolution is really both mathematically and culturally brilliant. The person from the introverted culture just goes in a continuing backward spiral motion. So they go back and back until they're pinned in a corner, being breathed upon by a lusty extrovert. You don't need to go to the United Nations to see it. You see it every day in your office. The designated extrovert in your hallway pokes his head in the door and says, good morning. And all the introverts stiffen and say, oh, God, he's going to hug us again. And he does, and it's not that introverts are against hugging. It's just that they have hierarchically organized, designated huggers and huggies, into which space he does not offer himself and is not wanted. And it's not that extroverts are hustling or hassling, not necessarily. It's just that the bounds of conviviality that define his personal space extend in such a way to include you. And one muggy morning in Melbourne, there's this clash of personalities. You know who I think sees us coming before anybody else? The ambiverts here. Those of you in the middle. You're able to spot these incipient conflicts. And you're able, because you can partake of either of those styles of interacting with relative impunity, with less cost than those at the extreme, you're able to mediate those. We speak differently. Extroverts prefer black and white, concrete, simple language. Those of us who are introverts prefer parenthetically complex, contingent, weasel word sentences, more or less, as it were, not to put too fine a point on it, like that. What happens when we are on the same team? Well, I'll give you one example. I had a consulting contract in Canada that I shared with a colleague who was as different from me as two people can be. First, his name was Tom, and mine isn't. Secondly, he's 6'5", and I have a tendency not to be. Third, he's a card-carrying extrovert. I'm certifiably introverted. We had seconded to our project a fellow from the finance department. Let's call him David, because that was his name. He almost brought the project to a crashing halt. He was terrible. And the person who seconded him asked Tom and me what we thought of David. And Tom responded in classic extrovertese. I'll tell you what he said in a minute. Then they said to me, Brian, what do you think of David? Here's how we sound to extroverted ears. So I said, well, David has a tendency at times of behaving in a way that some of us might see as perhaps more assertive than is normally called for, which was exactly what I thought. Tom rolled his eyes. He said, Brian, that's what I said. He's an asshole. Now, as an introvert, I might gently allude to certain assholic qualities in this man's behavior, but I'm not going to lunge for the A word. But the extrovert says he walks like one, if he talks like one, I call him one, and we end up talking past each other, and it hurts. It can hurt. I'm looking out now at the room, and if I were an extrovert, I'd be seeking rewards. And as introverts, we're trying to avoid punishments. Extroverts are great at seeking rewards. They find rewards. Those of us who may be more introverted, and particularly those who are neurotic and introverted, could be fairly described as a bit paranoid. They look out, oh my gosh, what's going wrong? Right now, is anybody bored? Is anybody mal-comprehending? Is anyone irked? I would be able to spot it at 300 meters. The extrovert actually suffers from the opposite of paranoia. It's called pronoia. Pronoia. It's a delusional belief that other people are plotting your well-being. Or are saying good things about you behind your back right now. We need those differences again. Evolutionarily, could you imagine if we could have ever evolved as a species if we didn't have people who were seeking out rewards, like prey, and others were avoiding negatives, like predators? It sort of helps if we have a bit of each in the human gene pool. If I stopped here, I would have done you a disservice. And here is where I said I would end with a plea that we get beyond putting people in trait categories. I think that we often act out of character, and this is vital. Don't ask people after, what are you, extrovert or whatever. I prefer that you ask them, what are the core projects in your life that matter to you? The kids we alluded to, the parent who you've been trying to get into a care home and can't, and it gnaws at you. These are the things that really define our personality and our character, not our traits. Traits are necessary to understand. That's why I've spent time on them today. But they're not sufficient to capture the way we're like all other people, like some other people, and like no other person. The no other person, the idiosyncratic you, what I call the idiogenic nature of you, in contrast to the biogenic or the sociogenic, is vital. These are the personal projects that shape your life. And they may enjoin you to act out of character. I'm a professor, and it seems my job is to profess, which means to convey with passion what I believe to be true, no holds barred, because I love my students, and I love my field, and I can't wait to tell them about it. And if I have to stand on my head, even though I'm an introvert, I overload, I'll do it. It's called professionalism, and I'm not rare. You are, many of you, acting out of character at work. As a pseudo-introvert, you're really extroverted, but you need to sit 10 days cranking, thinking up algorithmic choices that defy the odds of pragmatic certainty. You act out of character. We also do it out of love. You may be realizing right now that for 7 years, you have acted out of character through what I call a free trait. You're an introvert, but you act as a pseudo-extrovert. That's a free trait of extroversion. And we do that because we love people. Can we do this without cost? I don't think so. I think there is a cost that we might pay. We may burn if we protractedly act out of character. And so one thing that I like to talk about are restorative niches in which we can return to our first nature, our biogenic nature, after we've acted out of character, after you have acted out of character in your life. You're a mom, and at a party, you're putting on a birthday party for your daughter, and you want to have a great party, so you act as a pseudo-extrovert. After, if you're an introvert, and you've been acting out of character, you need a restorative niche, or a large, large bottle of wine. I'll give you one example, and then I'm going to wrap up. I used to go down to talk to military officers at a training base for senior officers. These were people who were going to end up being colonels but didn't know it. And they wanted to know about human personality. So just, what is it about the personality of, I don't know, the President of the United States? Not a good example. It used to work until a few weeks ago. Yeah, right. And so I would lecture for 3 hours, and then there was a break, and then another 3 hours. So it was really heavy going. And I would, because I'm introverted, I overload. And, you got 27 officers, which is 54 eyes looking at you. And at the break, they wanted me to go to the officer's mess. I would have been a mess if I'd gone. So I begged off. If you're like I do, sometimes say, I just wanted to beg off. Imagine having to beg off because of your personality. So I would go for a walk by the Richelieu River, which ran by the campus. And I'd look at non-existent craft, because that was my cover story. I was interested in the boats. And I would lower my level of arousal, come back and give a lucid talk in the afternoon. The campus moved, and the river stayed where it was. So I had to find a new place to go. And there's one 62 paces from this podium, and I'm going to show you it. Here it is. This is the men's room. I would hide in the men's room. And this particular day, I remember, well, the cubicles are at the top, the urinals are on the side, and so I went as far away as any person would go from the action. There were a lot of extroverts in the room that day, in the men's room, and went to the furthest cubicle and began to lower my level of arousal. But we always have these detectors that say, extrovert alert, extrovert alert, extrovert alert. I could hear an extrovert coming. They have a way of walking and a way of humming that is distinctive. Ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-bum. He's about to go in the second cubicle, a few away from me, that's safe. I'm looking underneath at his feet. He must have recognized my non-standard issue military footwear. And boom, ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. He walks down cubicle 3, cubicle 4, cubicle 5. My heart's going boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. He sits down cubicle next to me, and then I hear various evacuatory noises unmuffled. We hate that as introverts. We don't even like our own. That's why we flush during as well as after. Then I heard this gravelly voice saying, "Hey, is that Dr. Little?" If anything is guaranteed to constipate an introvert for 6 months, it's talking on the toilet. So what I do now, and I'm going to in 4 minutes, 12 seconds, when I go to the washroom as a restorative niche, as a pseudo-extrovert, trying to muddle through life and its vicissitudes, I put my feet up so nobody can find me. So don't look today. Now, my students at Cambridge said, "Oh, this group should be challenging for you." I said, "Yeah, I'm delighted to be talking. I'm honored to be talking to them. My son and daughter are in your field, and they were really impressed that I was talking. I told them I was talking about advanced algebraic systems." But they said, no, the most interesting thing you could give them is the stuff on frequency of sexual intercourse. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That would be gratuitous and intrusive. No. So I'm not going to do that unless you would like to hear about the frequency differences between extroverts and introverts in intercourse? Yes! Took 4 extroverts to say, is he still talking? Yeah! Well, let me give you the frequency. This was done, to my understanding, with heterosexual groups in 1980s in Germany. And so don't draw invidious comparisons, but it was interesting. That how many times per minute? Oh, sorry, that was the rat study. How many times per month do introverted males engage in the act? 3. Extroverted males, more or less. Remember, greater frequency? 5.5, almost twice as much. For the introverted males here, could I just say one thing? Could you hearken back in your notes to the quality-quantity trade-off? Extroverted women, 3.1, sorry. Extroverted women, frankly speaking, as an introverted male, they are heroic. 7.5, they not only handle all the male extroverts, they pick up a few introverts as well. Now, what has this not been, it hasn't been a plea to put yourself in a pigeonhole. It's to understand how traits can influence the shape of your projects and therefore your life. It's a plea for tolerance in these diverse ways of being in the world. And it's a plea to take care of yourselves. I think we need what I call a free trait agreement, where I will act out of character, you will act out of character. Your kids will learn to act out of character to advance core projects in their lives. This is good. It's not phony. It's not fake. It's dramatic. It's noble. But you need to have that restorative niche before you burn yourself out. And the final thing we need, you have an abundance. And that is the capacity to see the light side of life. Humor is transcendentally vital to a life well lived. I'm convinced that you're on the right trajectory. Thank you very much and take care.